All right, so I want to officially welcome you to our UNC Greensboro CACE conference, the Conference on African American and African Diasporic Cultures and Experiences. It is here today on our second day, February 23rd. I am Regina McCoy. I'm a professor in the Department of Public Health Education, and I also am a Provost Fellow for Student Success. And so I bring welcome to you today, not only from my department, from our campus, but also from the Provost Office, as we support everything you're doing and bringing to us in relation to how do we grow and make sure that we are understanding and experiencing the African American and African diasporic culture. So I love the title, And Still We Rise, Black Space Making, Place and Community. And I thought today, I would like to talk to you about my journey of space making here at UNCG and where I think we are right now. I started at UNCG as a faculty member full-time in 1998. And in 1998, this campus looked different, but I loved this campus. I loved the space. It was open. I loved that it was a place where you could just stretch and grow and ask questions, and just, it was the academic unit that I wanted it to be and thought it would be. I didn't know that it would be my work home for 24 years. And I didn't know when I first started that I was the first hired Black faculty member in my department. That was just 24 years ago, and I was the first. So I didn't see many Black faculty or faces that looked like me in school meetings. I didn't see them really too much when I stepped outside of my building. In my building, we housed athletics. And you know what? Athletic programs were still very much Black students. And so I became mothering to them and mothering to my own students in my program. We always had more than 50% of our student body in our undergraduate program to be Black or African students. This is something that we still are today. So I was there for the students, whether they're in my program or outside my program, but I gotta tell you, I didn't see many adults who looked like me until Miss Ora. Miss Ora was our housekeeper. And Miss Ora was the mother I didn't have. I'm a Washingtonian, so I didn't have my mother here in North Carolina. She was my confidant on those days where I just didn't know what I was gonna do. She was a caretaker for me. And I have to tell you, today I honor Miss Ora because she fed me soul food when my soul was weak, when I needed someone in my corner to wrap their arms around me because the days were hard. It was Miss Ora who comforted me on the day when the UNCG police stopped me in my building because I was working late and they thought that I didn't belong there. Yes, I know they were doing their job, but you know how those experiences just trigger that past experience of racial profiling. And even though they were doing their job, I was hurt. I felt as if I did not belong. Next day, I'm talking to Miss Ora as I normally would do. I would come in early and we would have coffee together as she's cleaning. And she snapped those gloves off and she said to me, you know what? Yes, baby, it was a hard thing. I'm sorry it happened. But I remember in church a couple of weeks ago that pastor said this quote from Shirley Chisholm: if they don't give you a seat at the table, bring a folding chair. And it reminded me and encouraged me about the future. It reminded me that that was a situation that I don't need to wound me and shade me and just anger me because I didn't know what to do with that anger. That was my personal journey. But what she was asking me to do is to bring that folding chair and to keep on keeping for those students who looked like me because they needed me. So I've been bringing a folding chair because Black space making is exhausting. It is very exhausting. It's tiring and your well empties out. And I have to ask all of you today to make sure that you replenish your well, just as Ms. Orr replenished it with me. because Black space making requires us to nudge and to push, and it's demanding, and it requires resistance. And that resistance is what we are about at UNC Greensboro. When we were a women's college, it was only after a court hearing, a court order, that helped us to integrate. A court ruling did that. That's resistance. That's what Black space making requires. It was Joanne Smart and Betty Tillman, our first Black African-American women who attended the Women's College in 1960. And it was Larry McAdoo. You can go to our UNC archives to see their pictures, but Larry was believed to be the first African-American student, male student, to graduate in 1966 from UNC Greensboro. So that resistance led the way to bringing in more folding chairs, right, at UNC Greensboro, the Neo-Black Society. They had to fight for that. Go to our archives and see what that fight and struggle looked like. Having this own program here, the African American and African Diasporic program. And notice I say program and not department. Take note of that. So there's resistance that we have to keep pushing and asking for our own space. And yes, it is our space just as much as anyone else's, but for some reason we still have to ask to be at the table at times. It's changing, right? So Dr. Andrea Hunter is the Chancellor Fellow for Campus Climate, and she's created some EDI dashboards. If you get a chance, please look at our dashboards, because Andrea Hunter is saying, not only you're going to be about it, you're going to do about it. You're going to see the data and use the data to help shape who we want to be, because she has seen what we were, and she is seeing what we're trying to do, and she's asking us to interrogate that. Because if we're going to make change and meet our call to action, it's going to require us to make some space for others to be at the table. So I want you to remember our call to action, and I thought about it this morning at UNC Greensboro. I was reading up on our call to action, and it says, we want to be a university where the equity and diversity inclusion are not only what we say, but what we do and more, who we are, such that it is a part of our DNA. That's our call to action for equity, diversity, and inclusion. It's what we say, what we do, and who we are. And that means change. And change makes me think of my favorite author, Octavia Butler. I'm a sci-fi nerd, and her Earth Seeds series. Everyone thinks of Octavia Butler and her Wild Seed book or her Kindred book, but I think of her Earth Seeds books, which are like the Parable of the Sower, which is the first one. And I use these books, sci-fi or speculative fiction, in my class, because in public health, we have to reimagine or imagine a world that supports everyone, that supports people thriving. And we don't always know what that looks like. The pandemic has taught that most recently. So that means we have to think outside the box, and that requires imagination. That requires us to move beyond the fences and the hedges and the boulders and the problems that are in front of us. How do we reimagine something different? So I ask you, just like I do in public health, bring in speculative fiction into your classroom so that students can be able to be more creative in tackling those problems that are in front of them. And so when I think of Afrofuturism and Octavia Butler, the one quote I remember is, all that you touch, you change. All that you change changes you. That's an Earthseed. The book of Earthseed, right? All that you touch, you change, and all that you change changes you. So I ask my students in class, when we're tackling public health problems, to think about, where are we going? What sort of future are we creating? Is this the kind of future you want to live in? If it isn't, what can we do to create that better future? Individually, in groups, how can we do that? And so we're asking UNCG to change so that they can change us, so that we can have a better future for all of us. So how is UNC Greensboro changing? How are they saying and being and doing the things that require a university to front and center equity, diversity, and inclusion so that it's a part of our DNA? Collectively, we're doing that. And I have to tell you that it's taking some time, but there are some efforts that we're seeing that are making that difference. And it's not just that tokenism that we've seen in the past. We are really trying to change our environment and our community. And some of the ways we're doing that is through leadership development. So our chancellor and provost invests in leadership with faculty of color through the Center for Creative Leadership Development Program. For scholars of color, we have the Provost Faculty Leadership Academy and the Provost Fellow Program, of which I am a part of. We also have the Chancellor has put together leadership, virtual leadership brown bags on Fridays with the goal to really introduce faculty to university leaders, kind of see behind the scenes, so that we can have an understanding about the institutional experience and the priority areas here at UNC Greensboro. Larger efforts are around us to support retention and promotion. We're really looking at how can we promote and give tenure to faculty of color who've earned it. We're also continuing our efforts for early career faculty to attend Faculty Success Program, and that's conducted through the National Center for Faculty Development and Diversity. So these are very small steps, but incrementally, they're building into a change, and they're helping us to change and shape the DNA at UNC Greensboro. And the work has to continue, we know that, and it has to continue with intention, focus, and commitment. So this work is exhausting, just as I'm reminded in '98, how exhausting it was to be the only Black face around the table. I then remind myself that Joanne Smart and Betty Tillman and Larry McAdoo probably were exhausted too. But if it wasn't for them pushing through and resisting, I wouldn't be here. So they found food for their soul. We've got to continue to find food for our soul. And I think that's what the CACE conference is. And I'm happy that you're here. So push through all the noise that's going to happen today. I know you're going to get emails, you're going to get text messages. The world is going to ask you to divert your attention and pay attention to them. We are asking you today just to feed your soul and increase your well by being present today here with us as we grow and hear from our colleagues across the state and even across the region. If you also get a chance, I want to put a plug in for Dwayne Cyrus's art exhibit. It is called Black at Intersection. It's here in Winston-Salem at the Sika Gallery. If you get a chance, it's going to be all the way through March, and you get to see UNCG in another city all displayed on the walls. As we see students that are in movement and dance, they're showing us the intersectionality of what it means to be Black, but they're showing us that through art and dance. So thank you for doing what you do in your classrooms and community. I hope that you enjoy today. We now have our next opening session. Dr. Torren Gatson is going to introduce them.
Thank you, Dr. McCoy, for that wonderful introduction. Good morning, everyone. My name is Dr. Torren Gatson, Assistant Professor in the Department of History here at UNCG. And it's my distinct honor today to introduce you to this panel, which I'll be chairing, of 4 of my current graduate students in the Museum Studies program. This panel session is entitled Black Placemaking in Museum Studies. And so first, I'm going to take the opportunity to just share with you a bit of information about our program and also what the students are doing and how this project is a part of a larger course. And so our Museum Studies program at UNCG is a highly competitive program that merges theoretical frameworks of public history with practical application. And so students engage in a 2-year-long program that forces them to really understand the values of community engagement while working within the realm of public history and specific museum studies, but there are various offshoots which students have interest in and follow tracks in. Now, our capstone course is a year-long 2-semester concurrent fall and spring course that immerses students in real-world experiences. Each student identifies a live community partner, and they work with that partner to create a tangible, final, impactful public product. And those products are what our students are here to show you what they've been diligently working on and some of the fruits of those labors, which all have a strong resemblance or fit squarely within this notion of Black placemaking, specifically within museum studies. And so I'm going to announce the 4 panelists, and then they will present in the order in which I announced them. Please feel free to populate any questions that might be stimulated from this conversation. After all 4 participants have gone, I will scroll through the Q&A box, which should be located at the bottom of your browser, and we'll go through questions specifically for the participants. And so our participants today are Liz Konopka, Cliff Whitfield, Chris Munster, and Sade Comiska. I will now turn it over to you, Liz.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gatson. I have a few slides that I will share my screen, if I can. Have the slides populated for everybody? Okay, excellent. All right. Good morning, everyone. As Dr. Gatson said, my name is Liz Konopka, and I am a second-year graduate student in the Museum Studies program here at UNCG. My capstone, Before Us Lay the City of Strangers, The Freedom Seeker's Journey, is with Dr. Brian Robinson at UNCG Libraries on his digital textbook project. I am creating Arcgis story maps based on first-person narratives of freedom seekers from North Carolina. These maps provide insight into the paths freedom seekers took and the struggles they faced, bringing the Underground Railroad to life in a more tangible way through these personal stories. This project engages learners in new histories and places freedom seekers at the center of their own narrative. The project's goal is to take a multimedia approach to freedom seeker narratives. Rather than a traditional text-based approach, the project combines audio, ArcGIS mapping, images, and text to bring freedom seeker narratives to life in a more visible manner. My contribution to the project is the creation of 4 story maps. One based on the narratives of Harriet Jacobs and her brother John Jacobs, one based on James Curry, one based on John Little and his wife, and the final map based on a combination of narratives from William Still's book, The Underground Railroad. Freedom seeker narratives are the narratives of enslaved people who escaped to freedom. Narratives often covered an enslaved person's childhood and experiences in enslavement, and then detailed the events of their journey to freedom, to free states, or to Canada. Freedom seeker narratives were typically published in conjunction with a third party, as many formerly enslaved people could not read or write and did not have access to the same publishing capabilities that white people did. Upon reaching freedom, many formerly enslaved people would often tell their stories to white journalists and abolitionists, who would then transcribe the stories and publish them in newspapers or in book format. In the cases of literate freedom seekers, they sometimes published their own words in their own way. John Jacobs' story, for example, was first published in 4 installments in the London journal, The Leisure Hour, a family journal of instruction and recreation, while his sister Harriet's story was published in a book entitled Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, written by herself. In the case of the abolitionist William Still, his vigilance committee assisted many enslaved people with gaining freedom along the Underground Railroad and interviewed railroad travelers as they passed through Philadelphia. Their stories, all of different lengths based on the information volunteered by the freedom seeker in question, were then published in the 1872 book, The Underground Railroad. My methodology for this project is straightforward. I read each narrative, taking notes on the most prominent events and quotes. I list out each location mentioned by the narrator, along with bullet points of pertinent occurrences. And as I was reading, I was struck by how specific the locations were, given that each narrator was on the run and fearing for their lives as they traveled. James Curry, for example, knew that he was about 45 miles specifically outside of Washington, D.C. when he was separated from his brothers. For the narrators to know and remember their precise locations through times of such emotional turmoil was astonishing to me and made it even more important that I keep thorough track of each location mentioned and make sure to include each one on the map. If it was important enough for the narrator to include when they told their story, it was important enough for me to include on the maps. I then plot each point on the story map, including narrative text and quotes to tell the story of what happened in each location. My final step is to search for public domain images to include. These are often representative rather than actual images, as most of the narrators never had a formal photograph taken of them, and it's difficult to find historic photos of locations that were swampland at the time these people were passing through them. So each map has had a slightly different outcome based on the nature of the narrative in question. This is Harriet and John Jacobs' map. They had very well laid out journeys with multiple locations, so their narrative fit easily into the Arcgis Map Tour function. The Map Tour allows viewers to zoom in and out of locations and follow a preset path. So you can see, you go from number one, the 1 through 6 are all kind of in the same area, so you can't see them on this. But then you move on to 7, 8, 10, and so on and so forth. 9's up here, but you follow a preset path through the map. So this worked really well for Harriet and John's stories. James Curry's story included many destinations with a lot of detail around each. So while I did include a map tour like the Jacobs siblings for viewers to be guided through, I also chose to create this static map with a guiding line so viewers could have a clearer and broader visualization of his route instead of always getting bogged down in the details of very specific locations. You can see a wider view of how lengthy his journey was to freedom. For John and Mrs. Little, I provided more textual narrative and worked within a more static map here as the viewers could zoom in and out, but weren't guided in the same manner as the map tour. And this was to illustrate the separation between their two journeys. You can see the red points denote John Little's journey, the blue points denote Eliza's journey, and then the gold points denote where they traveled together after they met and after they were married. And I had to go in yet another different direction to compile the narratives from William Still's The Underground Railroad. Here, I focused more on textual analysis since some of the stories were shorter based on what the narrator was able to provide. So I listed out each narrator's name and included information about their journey in paragraph form and added images, like this image from the Underground Railroad book, wherever I could. And then for the map itself, to avoid an excessive amount of guiding lines, since there were so many narrators traveling in different areas, I chose to color code them and list out their locations in the order in which they traveled. And then clicking on each map point brings up small textual analysis of the person's journey. So the viewers can then pick and choose whether they want to focus on Cornelia Williams or Jacob Brown, or look at the purple dots for Daniel Carr. So throughout this project, I've experienced several obstacles and had to find creative ways to solve new problems. The first is the problem every researcher encounters, and that's how to condense large amounts of information into understandable formats. Harriet's story alone is nearly 300 pages, and not all of that can be included in a story map without viewers getting frustrated and giving up halfway through of just the sheer amount of information. So part of my task has been to determine what the most important items are so I can make the maps readable, usable, helpful, while still doing justice to that person's story and including everything that needs to be included. I also had to learn new software with Arcgis. Before this project, I had never worked with any kind of GIS mapping. It took a lot of time testing out features to get my abilities to a place where I felt confident making these 4 unique maps and making them each stand out from each other. However, the obstacle that proved itself most frustrating for me was the names and pseudonyms within the narratives. Harriet Jacobs published her story under the pseudonym of Linda Brent and changed the names of everyone else in her story. At first, I assumed that Harriet had chosen a new name when she reached freedom, and that was what caused the discrepancy between the names. However, that was not the case, and I didn't realize this until I found a biography of Harriet by Jean Yellen, who had done lengthy research into her story and discovered that Linda Brent was actually Harriet Jacobs. I then had to match up names within Harriet's story and her brother John's story. John used real names throughout his narrative, so he would talk about his sister, refer to her as Harriet, and she was referring to herself as Linda. So I had to sit down and make lists of every person they mentioned and match up details between the stories to make sure I was using the correct names throughout my narrative in the map. Then, with John Little and his wife is never given a first name. I referred to her as Eliza earlier, but she's only referred to as Mrs. Little throughout her story and throughout her husband's, and that didn't feel like enough to me. I felt it was important for her to be referred to by name rather than simply as someone's wife. However, the time frame of this project taking course over fall and spring semester means I don't have the time or resources to thoroughly dig through census records, slave deeds, or free papers from the 1850s to try to find her name. And even more difficult is the fact that John Little is a common name. He may appear more than once throughout any given records. I also don't have exact ages for either of the couple, meaning I can't track them by birth records. So to find something of a solution, I reread Mrs. Little's testimony many times to try to find any possible reference to her name. And I did find one passage where she seems to refer to herself as Eliza. So I talked with Dr. Robinson about it and explained my reasoning, and we agreed that I could refer to her as Eliza as long as I explained at the beginning of the story map why I chose to do that and emphasized that the choice was based on that very specific passage from her narrative, which I quoted at the beginning of the map. My work shows the importance and necessity of Black placemaking in museum studies. These maps are tangible records of where Black freedom seekers traveled, what they experienced, and how they used their own agency to escape the horrors of enslavement and to seek out a better life of freedom. When we think of freedom seekers in more popular historical narratives, we often think of the main actors, such as Harriet Tubman or Frederick Douglass, and we think of the Underground Railroad in broader strokes. This project in particular places individual Black freedom seekers in their rightful spot within the historical narrative and creates a physical place for them on the landscape of the United States. I would like to thank Dr. Robinson, Dr. Gatson, and the UNCG Museum Studies Department for their support throughout this project. I would also like to thank the African American and African Diaspora Studies program for hosting CACE 2022. And thank you all for listening today.
Thank you, Liz. Next, we'll have Cliff Whitfield.
Can everyone see the slides? Good. So my project is the Historic Oddfellow Cemetery in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, digitizing and restoring a historic African-American cemetery. This project is being completed over the academic year, and I have partnered with the Historic Oddfellow Cemetery in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, which is a historically African-American cemetery that is no longer in use. I'm specifically working with the Friends of the Oddfellows. They are an organization seeking to restore the historic Oddfellow Cemetery. My deliverables are to create a website featuring the history of the cemetery and prominent burials. I'm also facilitating a publicity campaign to spread the word about the cemetery, and we'll be creating new physical handouts in the forms of brochures for visitors. This project will also be accompanied by an article-length paper. The historic Oddfellow Cemetery first began as the Oddfellow Cemetery and was formally founded in what is believed to have been the early 1900s by two fraternal Oddfellows lodges, the Twin City Lodge and the Winston Star Lodge. And this cemetery is the largest African-American cemetery in Winston-Salem. At the time, most African-American churches could not afford to have their own cemeteries. Therefore, there was a need in the community for this cemetery. The cemetery itself is the final resting place of over 10,000 people, some of which were enslaved people, veterans, notable business people, and members of the Oddfellows. The cemetery remained in the possession and ownership of those two fraternal orders, but was ultimately abandoned in the 1950s. The cemetery fell into disarray, and its condition became deplorable, as upkeep of the graves fell to the families of the deceased. Parts of the cemetery may have been paved over, and some gravestones and other markers have been destroyed or grown over by vegetation. The caretaker's house, which was the place where the cemetery's records were housed, was destroyed in a fire, and throughout the years, many people have tried to restore the cemetery, but the most concrete and impactful group has been the Friends of the Oddfellows. The Friends of the Oddfellows were founded in the mid-1990s and came together to care for and restore the cemetery. The Friends of the Oddfellows are currently clearing the space of the overgrown vegetation, hosting tours and events, and they are still finding and unearthing gravestones and markers. Ultimately, they would like to put in a Veterans Memorial Park that can serve as a seating area and place of reflection. The cemetery can serve as a powerful tool to empower the community and serve as a hub for genealogical research. Given the nature of the project and the needs of my capstone partner, I've done a considerable amount of background research to complete the deliverables for this project. The central piece of this capstone project is the website that I'm creating. So I'll begin by learning more about presenting history in digital or virtual spaces. I've also had to put a considerable amount of time into learning about marketing through social media and marketing for nonprofits, even going so far as to enroll in a course for marketing about nonprofits. I've been seeking out the best practices for both web development and web design. The information age has given us a powerful outreach tool in the form of social media, and most historic institutions have stepped into the 21st century and have created various social media accounts. However, managing these various social media platforms is a much more difficult task. The historic Oddfellows Cemetery primarily uses Facebook, so that would be their main point of digital interaction with visitors and the world writ large. One of the most crucial steps that I've found in my research for beginning any type of marketing campaign is creating or establishing a brand persona. The brand persona is built and based upon the brand's mission, values, positioning, voice and tone, as well as content. The Friends of the Oddfellows and the Board of Trustees' goal and mission are to restore and preserve not only the physical landscape of the cemetery, but the history that rests there too. As mentioned earlier, the board specifically uses Facebook to interact with visitors via social media. So I've been researching the best practices for using Facebook. I've identified some of the most important practices that can best serve the cemetery. Best practices include always sharing a link, photo, or video with status updates to drive users to the newly created website or any events that the cemetery may be hosting. It is important that the Friends of the Oddfellows encourage one another and visitors to interact with their Facebook page and share it amongst their friends and networks. It is also important to make sure that events are properly marketed and shared on Facebook to increase attendance. Moving beyond the technical aspects of planning and revamping a Facebook page, I've taken a good deal of time to familiarize myself with the history of the Oddfellows Cemetery. An important part was learning who the independent order of the Oddfellows are as an organization and what their mission is. The Oddfellows as an order aim to promote personal and social development while also seeking to improve every person and foster sympathy and aid those in need. Their charge is to visit the sick, relieve the distressed, bury the dead, and educate the orphan. The historic Oddfellows Cemetery was birthed during segregation, and from that charge, there was a need for a cemetery in which African Americans could be buried. At this time, many African American churches, as stated earlier, did not or could not afford to have their own cemeteries. The cemetery is an important piece of not only African American history, but Winston-Salem history. The cemetery itself was neglected, which is why it is in the condition that it is in. That level of neglect shows a real disinterest by the city and the community. This site is a rarity as it predates the merger of Winston and Salem and has the potential to serve as a powerful site for African American heritage. Part of the process for me has been learning about how similar sites have presented what more often than not is a form of difficult history. One of the first sources and examples I looked at was an anthropological study called The African Burial Ground in New York City, Memory, Spirituality, and Space by Andrea E. Fromm. So that burial ground was the largest and earliest known African descent cemetery in North America. The burial ground was actively being used from the years of 1712 to 1795 and is nearly 6.7 acres with roughly 15,000 people buried there. This burial ground had always been at the edge of town away from the European site and was only ever included on 4 civic maps. The burial ground was destroyed as Manhattan expanded further north by the end of the 18th century. I was immediately drawn to this book as I saw it as a cautionary tale for what can happen when spaces are obliterated from physical existence and in turn public memory. The primary sources that I've been dealing with are death certificates, draft cards, gravestone marker applications, and census records. I've been compiling this information in an attempt to recreate the lives of some of the people buried there so their stories can be highlighted. Secondary sources have led me to many different places. I've had to do a great deal of research about various ways to preserve African American history in the physical and digital space. I've also had to do a good amount of research on military history in an attempt to learn more about the veterans buried there. As with any major project, there have been obstacles that I've encountered and had to work around. One of the main obstacles I've been dealing with is a lack of burial records. As mentioned earlier, there was a fire in the caretaker's house where the records were kept, so burial records are few and far between. This was a privately owned cemetery, so the city of Winston-Salem did not have to be as concerned about keeping records. There's currently no completed map of the cemetery, meaning I cannot upload one to the website for visitors. As far as map making goes, it's difficult to create an accurate map because some of the gravestones have either been destroyed, lost, or are simply yet to be unearthed. A lack of a formal map also presents an accessibility issue for those that are unable to physically visit the site. The main deliverable for this project is a website. I'll be using Wix to design and create the website. I would like the history of the cemetery to be front and center for visitors. Because of the cemetery's age, a great number of people have been buried there. People of all different walks of life have been buried there, like pastors, businessmen like George W. Hill, the founder of Winston Mutual Insurance, and veterans like Spurgeon Ellington, a Tuskegee Airman, to name a few. Several people buried there are veterans that have served in wars like the Spanish-American War, the Philippine-American War, and World Wars I and II. The board would like to highlight those veterans and their histories. I would like the website to be a one-stop shop for the cemetery. With that being said, the website will feature a news and events page, a media page for pictures and videos, and an about page for the board. And lastly, the historic Oddfellows Cemetery was created as a direct response to a physical need for burial space. There were two African American chapters of the Oddfellows that came together to establish the Oddfellows Cemetery. The cemetery came about in a time where segregation was the norm in North Carolina, and African Americans had to create and carve out their own spaces. The establishment of the historic Oddfellows Cemetery is an excellent example of Black physical space making. Thank you.
Thank you, Cliff. Next, we will have Chris Munster.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Can everybody see my screen there? Okay, hang on. So for this panel, the title is Blandwood Mansion as a Site of African American History, but I also have the working title of Uncovering Hidden History of Blandwood. Okay. Hang on, let me move some things around. The Blandwood Mansion, the oldest surviving Italianate villa in the United States, has been attracting visitors from Greensboro and beyond since it was saved from demolition in the 1960s. Interpretive tours of the site highlight its most famous residents, the Moorhead family, and the collection of decorative arts and furniture placed throughout the property. Similarly, the published writing on the site adheres to this narrative, hesitating to stray from the traditional top-down method of historical recounting. Seldom is the presence of enslaved persons mentioned, although primary evidence clearly reveals that the patriarch, John Motley Moorhead, and his family actively participated in the practice of enslavement. Using a wide array of primary and secondary source material, my project will broaden the perception of Blandwood, elevating the lives of those without the Moorhead name to provide a more comprehensive study of the historic home. Furthermore, this writing will examine the evolving field of public history and trends in education, both troubling and encouraging, that add relevance to this piece. This is a warranted project, as those who choose to visit Blandwood Mansion are deprived of a full and honest history. As the contentious debate over historical truths rages on a nationwide scale, my writing seeks to set the record straight on an important aspect of Blandwood's local history, Greensboro's local history. Uncovering this hidden history has become my capstone project, as I attempt to fill in a large intentional gap in the historical record of one of Greensboro's most recognizable pieces of architecture. Indeed, the presence and agency of Blandwood's enslaved individuals and the institution of slavery in North Carolina are immensely critical elements to not only include, but elevate in any interpretation of the Blandwood property. So I'm conducting research and producing an article that will connect Blandwood history to African American history and the history of slavery. I am fully documenting the Moorhead family's active participation in enslavement, opening up the subject even more by closely examining the slave ownership of two prominent women associated with the property, Moorhead's daughter Letitia Moorhead and Anne Eliza Moorhead, the governor's wife. Because Blandwood is such an important site, not just Greensboro, but the entire state of North Carolina, my writing will bring forth acknowledgement and understanding of the practice of slavery statewide, and once again tie this directly back to Blandwood. As indicated by this quote, this is a warranted scholarly enterprise. Quote, when asked specific questions, please share as much information as possible, but recognize that there is little known information available to us, and we will work to rectify that challenge. End quote. Taken directly from the current rendition of their docent manual, this quote reveals the shameful direction that Blandwood gives to its docents, and this is essentially a cover-up. There is information. Students before me, some from our very own history department, have done the difficult research and presented their findings to Blandwood, only to see them tucked away neatly in the archives, not to be used in any public-facing historical retelling of the mid-19th century era and operations at the mansion. In reality, carving out the African-American narrative at the site is crucial, and there is no way to tell the full story of Blandwood without that vital element. I first embarked on this capstone project this summer when I had a Zoom meeting with Dr. Gatson, in which he discussed his involvement in development of a Thomas Day exhibition at Blandwood and invited me to become attached as well. As I understood the matter, my task would be to help construct a tour of the property which highlighted the pieces of furniture made by Day, but also informed visitors about his extraordinary life and some of the social and cultural dynamics at play during the tumultuous years he lived and worked, which overlapped the years Moorhead was governor of North Carolina. Bringing several pieces of Thomas Day's exquisite furniture into the Blandwood Mansion provided the opportunity not only to highlight his sophisticated skills as a woodworker, but also to invoke deep reflection on the racialized aspects of Blandwood seldom mentioned. I presented an interpretive plan to the curatorial committee, but shortly after, it became disappointingly clear that the rest of the exhibit team did not seem to agree on my interpretive approach and objectives and could not coalesce around the concept of centering the African-American experience in the exhibit, even though that directly advanced the project's big idea. As a result, UNCG withdrew from the project. Differences in curatorial vision between UNCG and scholars and the rest of the team was too stark, and we could not continue supporting the forthcoming exhibit. In this first iteration of the Capstone project, there was intentional focus on reimagining how spaces in the home and objects held there would have been perceived and used differently among the varying classes and races of people that were present at the site on any given day. This remains a focus of my research and will be incorporated into the final edition of the writing. As mentioned earlier, a wider study of enslavement patterns statewide in North Carolina is required, and part of my research methodology will be tying those patterns, specifically urban enslavement, back to daily life at Blandwood. Additionally, contemporary debates over the shifting role of public history institutions grappling with the subject of enslavement at their sites will be discussed, with insights gained from the wide range of literature on the topic applied to the operations of Blandwood. Situating Blandwood in modern-day downtown Greensboro also offers an opportunity to compare and contrast other historical sites present there and reemphasize the need to promote narratives centered on African-American history. Finally, the writing addresses the current contentious arguments over history education and how sites like Blandwood can contribute positively by reversing their whitewashed depictions. Much has been written in the last 2 decades on the role and responsibilities of public institutions, such as Preservation Greensboro, in fostering community engagement with the past and providing some semblance of civic education and advocacy. Additionally, how race in the United States has been woven through the collective consciousness of the public and the origins of our modern struggles concerning racial issues will be included in this project. This information is pertinent and is brought about in a section dealing with demographics in Greensboro and audience engagement at Blandwood Mansion. Book-length studies included in the bibliography for the paper include, but are certainly not limited to, Edward Baptist, The Half Has Never Been Told, Slavery in the Making of American Capitalism, Clifton Ellis and Rebecca Ginsburg, Slavery in the City, Architecture and Landscapes of Urban Slavery in North America, James Oliver Horton, Slavery in Public History, The Tough Stuff of American Memory, and Gary Nash, History on Trial, Culture Wars and Teaching of the Past. Sadly, the amount of primary research material is not necessarily copious. However, finding ways to make the most out of the small amounts of information should be seen as an opportunity, not necessarily an obstacle. Indeed, as mentioned earlier, an important bevy of material comes from previous research done by our very own history department. In the spring of 2015, UNCG professor Dr. Chris Graham led his class through an in-depth exploration of an account book belonging to a daughter of Governor Moorhead, and what they discovered and documented is illuminating, but withheld from public knowledge mostly. Records beginning in the 1850s reveal that in addition to his large estate in Guilford County, Moorhead also had involvement in Point Plantation, a property that straddled the Yadkin River with acreage in Davidson and Davie counties, run primarily by his daughter, Letitia Walker Moorhead. The dutiful research of Dr. Graham's students was then organized in a binder that included an editorial introduction and a glossary of nearly 100 identified individuals who labored there. A roundtable discussion was held with the class and staff and docents at Blandwood, and although Dr. Graham was satisfied with the surprise of their findings, the staff has been reluctant at best to incorporate this research into their interpretive tours. At the mansion, Letitia is framed as a highly educated, talented artist and embroiderer, not an enslaver who kept specific records at a major plantation. Included also as a source is a slave deed taken from the People Not Property database dated 1824, in which John Moorhead is selling a 6-year-old girl named Mary to an acquaintance for $140. As routine as this may have been for this era, seeing in print the sale of a 6-year-old child between two powerful white men is striking, and the cruelty of practice of slavery should never be lost on anyone. This is a heartbreaking source, and I shudder to think that there are countless others just like it. But as difficult as it at times can be, public history professionals, which I aspire to become, commit themselves to observing and promoting the spaces that hold the true history of their communities, and those that engage in the stories of the past deserve to see full representation within those stories. Black space-making at Blandwood evokes the conversations the public has neglected to have when confronted with difficult historical truths. Institutions like Preservation Greensboro rely heavily on audience engagement and maintaining some frequency to their guided tours. However, I question the impact and outreach potential they have, given the distorted nature of how they interpret the site. Anecdotal evidence from former docents has informed me that the average visitor is middle-aged and not racially diverse. This project explores how, as mentioned above, the site is situated in an area suffused with the African-American history of Greensboro. Is it possible to trace how the Black experience related to Blandwood, in the era in which it served as residence of Governor Moorhead and his family, conditioned the desegregation efforts at the Woolworth's lunch counter, another important historical location in downtown Greensboro, a century later? What should be made of the mansion's adjacency to the storied neighborhood of Warnersville? The first heritage community in the city, the land for that neighborhood was planned by Quaker Yardley Warner and made available to emancipated freedmen around 1865. Urban renewal in the late 1960s virtually erased much of the history and magnetism of the area, resulting in the space being unremarkable to many Greensboro residents today. Blandwood Mansion shares some culpability for the erasure of African-American history in downtown Greensboro, yet it can be restored. A challenge is to withhold from the impulse to heavily criticize overseers at Blandwood for this ongoing historical malpractice. Although divorced from the Thomas Day Project, investigations into the preparation and marketing of the exhibit reveal that the ahistorical tendencies of the staff and curators are becoming more entrenched. My work aims to be a corrective, a simple but genuine effort to expand the exhausted, contrived version of the Blandwood story. The rapidly changing demographics in the community and fierce battles over history and historical memory demand some form of an updated interpretive approach to this important segment. Beyond the necessity of this project, I firmly believe that public historians have an immense responsibility to improve society by revealing to the population how history is important and that often the marginalized events and figures of the past teach valuable lessons. I argue that what the stewards of Blandwood have failed to include, even after other individuals and professionals have presented them with the evidence, is a major deficiency, but ultimately also an opportunity. As a mentor on this project has helped me to understand, it is all a matter of historical accuracy, not a disagreement about historical interpretation or even argument. In the end, race and slavery is an issue that I believe this country, the state of North Carolina, and especially historic sites such as Blandwood, can never afford to ignore. Including the African-American presence at Blandwood is not only conveying a more historically accurate narrative at the site, but by knowing this other story, we might better understand our modern selves and each other. I believe that if we walk away now, if we simply retreat into our respective corners and keep extremely important information concealed from public view, as Blandwood does every day, we will never be able to come together to learn the important lessons of history required to solve the challenges all people in the Greensboro community face as neighbors. Sure, a clear-eyed view of history can make someone comfortable, but it is in this discomfort with historical truths that we learn and grow, and together harness the collective power to move toward a more equitable and inclusive society. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Our final presenter, Sade, you have the floor as you transition to sharing your slides. Once again, I want to make the comment for anybody who just entered that the Q&A box is open at the bottom. If anybody has questions, of course, I have some comments after and questions for the panelists, but they would be more than welcome to also take your thoughts and questions. Sade, you have the floor.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Sade Comiska, and my project is titled Skill and Resistance, Black Craftspeople and Acts of Defiance. Skill and Resistance examines how, since 1619, freed and enslaved African Americans built this country on their backs. The hands of Black craftspeople were essential to the stability of the Southern economy during slavery. They were the Southern labor force. Yet their skills and contributions to American material culture tends to be overlooked by many historians. Moreover, with the partnership with the Black Craftspeople Digital Archive, my project aims to deeply analyze the contributions and influence Black craftspeople made to American material culture through the usage of runaway slave advertisements, and how their skill was a, sorry, I'm losing my train of thought, and how they use their skill as a form of resistance to the same system that oppressed them. Furthermore, my research question is, how did Black craftspeople use their skill as a form of personal agency? Resistance is defined as the refusal to accept or comply with something, or the attempt to prevent something by action or argument. White slave owners had the expectation that their slaves or property would obey their every command. However, when a slave ran away from their enslaver, they were gaining a personalized sense of agency by not complying with the expectations of a slave. Based on the definition of resistance, they were also taking action against the system of slavery. Black craftspeople were vital to the structure of a plantation, being described as a man of importance, the most valuable slave to his master. Now, if the most valuable slave runs away, how does that affect the plantation's dynamics? And what lengths would an owner go to retrieve their property? Likewise, in certain cases, many runaway slaves who had a trade would run away with the tools associated with their craft. For example, a seamstress running away with cloth and needles, or a carpenter with his tool bag. Many craftspeople would also attempt to pass for a free person of color. This is partially due to the fact it was a very common practice for craftspeople to be hired out temporarily to other plantations or owners. Additionally, runaway slave advertisements provide a unique perspective to the ability and the skill of an enslaved African American. Slave advertisements were written by slave owners who forced them to comment honestly on the intelligence and the craftsmanship of a slave. Acknowledging a slave's mental capacity was taboo unless it was in a runaway slave advertisement. In many instances, a runaway slave advertisement was the only time a slave was viewed with human-like qualities. However, the whole idea of a slave advertisement is to humanize. My research methodology began with exploring the Black Craftspeople Digital Archive and learning how to properly analyze runaway slave advertisements and understanding the language. The archive was the foundation to my research question, which eventually led to my secondary source. The first secondary source that I examined was W.E.B. Du Bois's The Negro Artisan. Du Bois closely examines the economic and social contributions to the Negro labor market post-Civil War, compared to the labor conditions from the antebellum period, which is the period I am researching. Du Bois's scope for the study further investigates the employment trends for Black mechanics and skilled laborers in every state. The report is critical to understand the overall importance a Black mechanic had to the system of slavery. Du Bois conveys how in many cases, when an enslaved artisan would be sold off to help on a project with another master, that they would be more knowledgeable on the project or the craft than the owner. Du Bois states that these Black mechanics carried the work. So overall, this source conveys how the Black mechanic was essential to the functionality of the Southern labor market. However, it also raises the question, if somebody was an essential worker to the Southern labor market, how are their contributions to American material culture left unanalyzed? This second book that I read was Gladys Marie Fry's Stitched from Soul, Slave Quilts from the Antebellum South. Fry adds another layer of analysis to my methodology, which is Black artisan women. Fry displays the infruitable evidence of the creativity slave women had in their craftsmanship as quilters and seamstresses. The stories of the enslaved women tend to be overlooked and denied history, yet their creative textiles and quilts allow their history to be preserved. Moreover, for an enslaved woman, quilting was a form of personal agency in a world where they didn't have a voice. Many quilts display family records and symbolize their religious beliefs. For the enslaved, the ability to choose a particular color provided them with the necessary emotional stability and independence. Fry argues that although slaves were denied the right to write, they could use quilting as their voice. For example, some women left physical attributes on their quilts, such as tears, blood, or even sweat, implying that indeed quilting was a form of emotional and physical expression. The system of slavery was designed to depersonalize the slave, yet the production of quilts was a subjective process. Allowing the enslaved craftswoman a sense of agency to personalize their quilts with family stories, births, and deaths, overall emphasizing the personalization and the emotion put into quilt making. The creation of quilts also contributes to this idea of American material culture and African American material culture. The third source I examined was Carolina Clay, The Life and Legend of Slave Potter Dave by Leonard Todd. Todd examines the life of David Drake. David Drake, commonly referred as Dave the Slave, was an enslaved artisan, potter by trade, and poet from Edgefield, South Carolina. David is known as one of the most outstanding African American potters of his time, yet he was enslaved. David, as a potter, would reclaim agency over his craft, although he was creating these crafts for his master. David personalized his work by adding lines on his work, such as "I made this jar," or connotation, which is Latin for chains and means linking together, overall symbolizing the slaves held in bondage, including himself. David would also write poetry in his pottery, emphasizing a way of personalizing his work and gaining authority over his labor. Overall, Carolina Clay is a critical secondary source to my research question, because David's life overall was a form of defiance, because one, he could read in a time where slaves were not allowed to read. And he would also use his creation as a form of direct resistance to slavery. All societal norms of the 19th century. And then, after my secondary source research, I delved back into primary source research, this time dissecting the Digital Library of American Slavery, the North Carolina Runaway Slave Database. This database holds runaway slave advertisements from newspapers across the state of North Carolina. Within this one database, I have identified over 200 runaway slave advertisements of craftspeople, from carpenters, needleworkers, seamstresses, bricklayers, and each ad conveys a different story. Some of these craftspeople would run away with their children, their spouses, and of course, they ran away with their skill. And I'm going to share an example with you of one of the runaway slave advertisements I found. So this is a runaway slave advertisement of Anthony. Anthony was a jack of all trades. So there's many things to unpack with Anthony's advertisement, from his racial identity, which is described as white, Native American, and Black. They also describe his facial features. They also go down to describing his character while he is drunk and while he is sober. The ad goes into depth to highlight the fact that he is very artful and skilled. It lists all of his skills, such as an excellent pressman, a carpenter, a bricklayer, a barber, a sawyer, a painter. He can manage the horses, and he knows about the medicines, and he could pull teeth. So they described him as a master vice and a jack of all trades. However, the trade that stands out the most to me is the fact that he is a pressman working in the newspaper printing office. He was also owned by the Star newspaper office, which all infers that, in fact, Anthony could also read and write. With just a preliminary analysis of his advertisement, we could assume his position in the press office has granted him certain privileges that other slaves who were laboring in the fields did not have. The Star office is in Raleigh, North Carolina, meaning Anthony was an urban slave rather than a rural slave, which had privileges in itself. We can also assume that Anthony had access to reading and writing materials and access to connections around the state, meaning due to Anthony's skills, his chances of successfully running away were very high. I could also argue that any newspaper he assisted in pressing was his contribution to American history. Healing resistance ties back into the realm of Black placemaking and museum studies in several ways. First, a large portion of this project is just contributing runaway slave advertisements into the Black Craftspeople Digital Archive, which is the largest archive holding Black artisanship. And it seeks to enhance what we know about Black craftspeople and highlighting the lives of Black craftspeople in all the objects they produce. Secondly, working with the Black Craftspeople Digital Archive is a unique experience and is further illuminating the importance of Black craftspeople and how they built this country with their hands. And it is important as a public historian working in museum studies to accentuate these conversations regarding American decorative arts in the South. Thank you.
Thank you, Sade. At this point, with all presenters having gone, I'm gonna open the floor for any questions, but you still have an opportunity to pose your questions in the Q&A box, marked Q &A at the bottom right-hand corner. And so feel free to drop any questions you may have there. But while I wait for any questions to populate, a few thoughts were stimulated through those great presentations. And so I'll ask a few questions. My first question is actually, these questions are for the entire group. And so we can go in order of those that presented as far as responses. But first, can each of you discuss how your project pushes the conversation of community engagement, not necessarily with just your prospective partner, but engaging with the public audience which you seek to serve and educate?
So with my project going into Dr. Robinson's digital textbook project, it will be used as an educational tool so the greater public audience can start to explore various slave narratives. And it's also been working in conjunction with the Digital Library on American Slavery at UNCG. So those different aspects engage with the public by putting the information out there and saying, here's a new way for you to explore. You might not be familiar with slave narratives or freedom seeker narratives outside of something like Frederick Douglass, but through this, you can start to explore it in different ways and start to learn on your own terms and try to see it visually rather than just reading through something that might be a little denser than the general public audience might be used to.
Thank you.
Well, I think the Oddfellow Cemetery has a great need for community engagement as it's completely grown over almost. So they've had to go out there and kind of physically restore the landscape. But I think it also speaks to a need in the community. The cemetery's been there for a long time, about 110 years or 120 years, I believe. So, and the history, it's been there, and people have grandparents, aunts and uncles, other people buried there. They just don't have access to these grave sites because they've been covered or paved over. So I feel like it presents an excellent opportunity for people to come out and work and get to know the history and help unearth the history.
Great. Chris?
Yeah, as I mentioned, I think, as it is now, the interpretation is a little bit stagnant. And I think, opening up the history more, exploring the more social, cultural elements beyond, the material culture that's at the site, I think might draw a younger, more diverse audience. And I think also kind of what I'm presenting to connect it to some of those other sites downtown and situating it where it is downtown will help the better Greensboro community see that site in relation to the rest of the history that's down there.
And then to answer that question, we live in a day and age where technology is important, and the digital historical arts is a growing field within public history. And in order to engage with such younger generations who are always on their phones, having a digital archive allows that engagement, because you could literally go to Google and look up digital archive, and the Black Craftspeople digital archive will be right there. And the Black Craftspeople digital archive doesn't just focus on North Carolina, it also focuses on Tennessee. It also has a growing Instagram following. So it's a lot to learn from the archive itself.
Thank you for that. One question did populate in the box. And I believe this, Sade, is forwarded to you. Did other enslaved persons without unique skills gain motivation based on how they perceived those with the unique trades and skills?
Yes, so there was definitely a sense of privilege for runaway slaves or slaves in general who had a skill, where there is one book where it kind of discussed these relationships between those who had skills and those who didn't. And in some cases, of course, there would be resentment or a sense of jealousy, but overall, it was more of, who got trained as a skilled artisan. There really isn't a lot of research saying who got picked. It was kind of like you just were dealt a better hand with the cards. And yeah, but there is definitely those type of relationships on a plantation where they had a sense of privilege over other slaves who did not have skills.
Fascinating. I think it's very important too for us to be able to situate, or for you all to be able to situate to your audience why you've done a great job explaining how impactful these products are and how they are nestled squarely within placemaking. But could each of you discuss how you came to find your project and agree to take on, and perhaps why you agreed to take that specific project? Just as a refresher, students are allowed, and it is oftentimes recommended that they acquire their own capstone project, as they will be matched with that project for a 2-semester long year project. And so it's important to understand just why the students chose the projects they chose in certain instances. So if all of you could speak to that.
So about midsummer this past summer, I had reached out to Dr. Gatson, and I wasn't sure of what I wanted to do with the capstone. I'm relatively new to Greensboro, so I wasn't super sure of what kind of community organizations were out there that would be looking for some kind of project. So I told him I was interested in working with women's history, and I wanted to do something digital because I really wanted to build my digital history skills. And he connected me with Dr. Robinson. Because it is a digital-based project, and with Harriet Jacobs' narrative and some of the stuff I'm working on this semester, which is focusing more on runaway slave advertisements specifically for women, there was that women's history focus, which is very much what I wanted to work on. And I was fascinated by the prospect of creating maps of freedom seeker journeys and really delving into that detail and doing a visualization of their journeys. So that's why I felt like this project was a really great fit for me, and I've really enjoyed working on it.
I also had a conversation over the summer with Dr. Gatson, and he put me in touch with the historic Oddfellow Cemetery, and I had a phone call with one of the members of the board there, and she went over kind of what they were looking for, their needs, and she gave me like a little bit of the history of the site, and I felt like it would be a good fit because it's kind of right in line with what I am passionate about, which is like local history and specifically African American history. So I thought it would be a good fit. I also enjoy like digital history and creating exhibits and things in that lane. So I also thought it would be a good fit with creating a website.
Thank you, Cliff.
So yeah, consistent with my classmates this summer, Dr. Gatson had a conversation. And as I mentioned in the presentation, this actually is not the project that I originally was attached to. I was working on that tour and developing things, interpretive plans for that. Essentially, I've just kind of taken off and am doing now this research and presenting this material kind of as an independent research project. But like the others, it stemmed from a conversation this summer. I was attached to a larger forthcoming exhibit.
Thank you, Chris.
And for me, last spring, I began a project in one of the other classes I took using runaway slave advertisements, which kind of piqued a real interest in me. So then after having a conversation with Dr. Gatson, he paired me up with the Black Craftspeople Digital Archive.
Thank you, Sade. So there's a question I want to make sure I get to that's placed in the chat. And the whole statement is very much relevant. So all of your presentations show there's much work to be done in creating narratives that are in the hands of the entire community. What can you tell us about, or what can you tell us about Greensboro specifically from your presentations, if applicable? And I'll open the floor to whomever wants to answer. So in other words, how does your project, or how can your project be an agent of change? How is it, relevant, or what can it tell us? Liz, you want to take a stab at it first?
Sure. So with the maps that I've done so far, and none of those narrators have been from Greensboro directly. But with the spreadsheet that I'm just starting to delve into of runaway slave advertisements, there have been a couple records of transactions that I've seen so far in Guilford County in Greensboro. So I think bringing those to light and acknowledging that there was an active slave trade in Greensboro and that people were bought and sold in this county, in the local counties, surrounding areas, and just kind of bringing that to light and to acknowledge it publicly and to say this happened and we can't change that, so we shouldn't hide it. We need to talk about it. We need to acknowledge that people did run away from this because it was traumatic, it was horrible, it was enslavement. And so I think to try to recognize that and to name people and to say these were people who were enslaved here, and we need to give them their voices back.
Excellent. And Chris, if you wanted to take a stab at it from this perspective of what do you think, needs to change in Greensboro's overall historical narrative as it may relate to your topic?
Yeah, I think to echo what Liz said, it just gives a better understanding of the practice of enslavement here in Greensboro, specifically urban enslavement downtown, kind of getting a better understanding of the nuances of that. And then as I'm trying to show in my own writing that, a lot of that then starts kind of these lines that trend in through the rest of history. And so if you can find something to connect to through projects like that and through realizing the different, classes, races of people that were present in the city. And it's just a more comprehensive, kind of more engaging history that includes multiple perspectives, which I think all of our projects are useful in that sense.
Thank you for that. My last question, I think it's very important for any of our students specifically who may be on the webinar at the moment listening, if you guys could speak to what skills, software development, or things that you've learned through the process of this capstone and being a part of the Museum Studies program, and specifically, and what kind of interactive and intuitive things you've learned as a part of this project. And that could be, as I mentioned, anything from digital software skills, communicative abilities, networking, data. Gambit.
The big one for me has been the ArcGIS mapping system, because that's everything I've created the maps through, and that was quite a learning curve. I spent probably about 3 or 4 weeks at the very beginning of the project on the wrong part of the website, working on the wrong kind of map, in tears every time I looked at it because it wasn't going the way I wanted to. I was like, I know what it's supposed to look like. I've seen other maps. Why can't I do this? And then realized, I was like, oh, there's a different function for that. And then I clicked on it. I was like, oh, this is so much easier. So there was very much that frustration, learning curve, figuring out what I'm doing. And I think too, learning how to present information in a different way. My research experience before has been just writing papers and doing an undergraduate thesis and the traditional sort of methods. So taking these freedom seeker narratives and having to interpret them in a different way to try to put it on a map while still including the written information, but not overloading it with text, and using images, adding in audio clips, trying to figure out how to make it more visual rather than just a text-based approach has been really fascinating. I think that's been a really good skill for me to build in future in museums, so it can be more interactive for people as they view different objects, different exhibits, different maps.
Thank you, Liz.
I've kind of spent a good deal of time learning Wix, the software that I'm using to design the website, kind of learning the ins and outs, learning how to make things look presentable, and figuring out the best kind of design for the web page that fits the content that I'm producing. I've also learned a great deal about Canva, using that to make brochures and different handouts and things like that for visitors. So, yeah.
Thank you, Cliff.
And then for me, I was really learning how to use Excel. I've never had to really use Excel before. So just learning how to log what I'm finding properly. And then also similar to Cliff, using Canva, and then, you know, upping my social media skills for the project.
Thank you for all of that. And so, sorry about that. Does anybody else have any questions or comments that they wanted to pose in the Q&A section? Now is the time. Well, I want to make sure that I restate some things I stated earlier in CACE. We definitely thank you for joining this session of the CACE series this morning. Once again, you had the privilege, and we had the privilege of sharing and the privilege of hearing the second year graduate students in the Museum Studies program at UNCG share their capstone projects. And these capstone projects, once again, are a year-long, 2-semester concurrent project that is, steeped in community engagement and aligns them directly with capstone partners. At the end of this semester, this coming April, these students will showcase their final projects in class, and will also gain a number of other opportunities to highlight and showcase their works at national conferences on public history and in other forms and fashions. And so I thank you all for attending this session. And if nobody has any other questions or comments, I will end there. Thank you all.